And welcome back to another episode of the Pixel Vision podcast. I'm David Rez, once again joined by
DeftBeck
and
Melora.
Okay, said that. I wasn't expecting it. But yes.
Melora! Do you think I wasn't?
I don't know, it's seductive sounding.
I'm excited to be here.
Alright, good. And today's episode is going to be on localization as well as adaptive translation for video games. So I'm very quickly going to just give a definition of what localization is for anybody that's not familiar with the term. Though I think most people are these days, from the Globalization and Localization Association. They know what they're talking about. Localization is the process of adapting a product or content to a specific locale or market. Translation is only one of several elements of the localization process. In addition to translation, the localization process may also include adapting graphics to target markets, modifying content to suit the tastes and consumption habits of other markets, adapting design and layout to properly display translated text, converting to local requirements such as currencies and units of measure, using proper local formats for dates, addresses, and phone numbers, addressing local regulations and legal requirements, etc., etc., etc. It also is kind of a mess most of the time.
Oh, yeah. So, we're going to start from the past localization.
Like ours.
A lot of what people characterize as localizations in the past would be, often you'd get a game that was very Japanese or very specific to one culture. They would change it entirely to suit another license or suit a Western culture. Or not a lot of games, honestly, did have a lot of text back then, but RPGs weren't even really that popular in the West for a while. So most of the games that would come over there, you wouldn't have a lot of text to change or a lot of graphics to change really. So localization wasn't as complex of an endeavor as it is now.
I think early then, like a lot of localization change had more so to do with just whatever visuals or themes were being represented. Kunio-kun being renamed to River City Ransom, for example. I think Karate Master was originally on the Master System, which is a basic side-scroller beat-em-up game, was originally a Fist of the North Star game. Not all the same thing in the least, but they just made the gameplay the same and changed the sprites and the name.
Which is weird because, as far as I know, Hokuto no Ken or Fist of the North Star was already a known thing in the early 90s, so I don't know, was the license just too expensive?
I think that's probably something for somebody to go look up.
I mean, they actually bothered to make a whole new Fist of the North Star film that you could get direct to video.
I didn't know that.
It's awful. I mean, I've only seen like the first couple minutes of it, but they basically do the punch, you're already dead thing. They recreate that whole thing from the beginning of the story, and then it's basically the whole first arc just in westernized. There's a lot of known examples in the NES and Super NES era of when they changed the whole visual design of the game in order to go suit another market. For example, there was a game that was more or less you're playing as this ninja character for the Super NES, and that was localized as Yonoid for the Super Nintendo, a platformer centered around the now defunct mascot for Domino's Pizza.
I still don't know how that was ever a good idea.
For those who don't know, the Noid was a mascot that represented, here's all the bad things that can happen to your pizza.
His name was short for Annoyed.
Yes. Here's all the bad things that can happen to your pizza on the way to your house.
We're clever.
And the guarantee was you could get it in under 30 minutes. But then people were actively just going out of their way to endanger the trackers. So the Noid was very quickly phased out.
Also, there was a man whose last name was Annoyed.
And
He literally held up the Domino's because he was under the delusion that they were talking about him with the basket.
I remember you telling me about this.
No, it's totally real and it's totally funny.
a very famous example from the NES era was the game Doki Doki Panic. This is a cliche at this point. Did you know Doki Doki Panic for the NES?
Today on Did You Know Gaming. Yeah, but it is weird though.
That game was translated to be Super Mario Bros. 2.
And it was originally based on an HD TV show.
It was a game meant to promote a cultural festival.
Yeah.
With the mascots of the cultural festival as the playable characters.
And it was still designed by Miyamoto.
Yes.
So it is in a lot of ways like a spiritual successor to Mario.
And the real Mario Bros. 2 didn't come out until 1991 for the US.
The Lost Levels, which was on the Super Mario All-Star card.
Because they thought it would be too hard for Americans, Super Mario Bros. 2.
this is hard. American don't like that. We'll be talking about that more, actually, as we go through localization. But difficulty, actually, is a really weird concept, actually, especially in the 80s and 90s, especially the 90s the most. A lot of the most painful, difficult 8-bit and 16-bit games we have, some people their mind might be blown by this. The Japanese versions are actually easier.
A lot of that has to do with Nintendo, because Nintendo wanted to fight the rental market.
Yep.
Because up until the point in which Nintendo effectively lobbied the Japanese government to ban the rental of video games, because they couldn't do that in the West, they would make it so unbelievably difficult that they could effectively stretch out the lifespan of a game in order so you could keep renting and renting and renting it over and over.
That's basically classic arcade tactics and stuff, which makes sense as arcade machines. If you could just put a quarter and beat the game once, then that's bad.
And to a certain extent, it didn't make a lot of people who grew up in the late 80s, early 90s really good at games.
Yeah, that's why a lot of them liked it. That's probably a good deal where speedrunning, probably gets its roots from, is people just playing the same game and getting really, really good at it until they start finding out new things about it.
Yes. Not only were things in game design changed, not just difficulty, but sometimes they would go and remove whole mechanics from the games to just make it... They would remove the story from the games, too, if they thought it wouldn't adapt well to Western audiences.
Yeah, Bionic Commando.
Like, there were cutscenes, right?
I believe so, yeah. They removed also, I believe, any references to Nazi paraphernalia, Hitler, and stuff like that.
It was the culture at the time. The fundamentalist conservative thing was a strong thing in the 90s. So, for example, Nintendo was very famously, they would remove crosses from the backgrounds of Castlevania, they would remove any religious references in order to avoid controversy, getting any kind of negative news attention from.
Yeah, and it usually seemed to vary depending on country, too. Like, West, especially in terms of America, they'd have religious references removed. But I think in the PAL region, it was even worse. Like, Castlevania Bloodlines, the title screen is like, and Melora definitely knows this,
Yes.
the title screen is like red blood in Japanese and the American version. In the PAL version, it's like blue.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's like supposed to be water or slime or something, but the thing is that title screen shows bones and stuff. So the whole meaning of the title screen is lost.
Yes.
It doesn't
And
make
the title.
any
That's the
sense.
title in general.
Oh yeah, they changed it from Bloodlines to something else, didn't they? What did they call it?
Australia was actually also part of this with Bloodlines, and they changed it over there too, and it's called Vampire Killer. They just... in this really cheesy, stretched out font. Like, just entirely the...
That's funny, considering the word blood and the image of blood is bad. But killer, yeah, that's fine. As well as a mythological figure that sucks on people's blood for sustenance. That's totally cool. It's a mock on the Holy Trinity.
Now, what did they
Localization doesn't make a lot of sense, by the way, in terms of actual logic. But actually, what's funny is that's still red, though. So they kept the red.
Let's just do a shitty gradient across the letters.
Yeah, like, it keeps the red, but then...
Oh, this is Japan.
Oh, Japan's called Vampire
Yeah.
Killer.
Yes.
Oh, no, they called... and they called it Castlevania The New Generation in here.
That's it, yeah. It had that stupid title.
So...
Way more safe than soft.
Yeah,
And they
Vampire
probably
Killer
censored
was
the
what
hell
was
out
called in
of
Japan.
crosses and blood and all that
And
stuff.
Castlevania The
known
New
for.
Generation was what it
Is
was.
that the sequel to
Star Trek Next
no.
Generation.
Castlevania The Next Generation.
Just, get a... What's the guy with the visor?
I know.
Fucking,
Yard.
Photoshop his visor over Alucard's face.
I mean, why Alucard? Alucard's not even relevant at this point yet. But I think it would be, actually, wouldn't it be the Belmonts? Because the weird thing with Bloodlines is it actually draws more inspiration from Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Bram Stoker.
Yeah,
Stoker. Why do I always say Stroker?
Bram Stoker.
Stoker.
That's terrible, dude.
I honestly have a serious problem where in my head I always think it's Stroker. There's probably a terrible XXX parody of that somewhere on Newgrounds. Don't look that up.
Oh.
So changing the in-game graphics was really common back in the sprite-based era. It sometimes happens today, like Bravely Default, the second game, End Layer. It was like a Native American-esque class.
Right.
Then they changed that to be a cowboy class.
And it's getting more into like the political aspects of censorship too, which I guess religion and sexuality definitely fit in with that as well.
Yeah.
I know it's a sprite-based game, so I kind of and it's in lieu of the
Bravely
earlier
Default is a
games.
3D game.
Bravely Default is 3D?
Yeah, it's on the 3DS.
I know it's on the 3DS, but I thought it was still sprite-based.
It's a 3D game.
Well, it still plays like FF6, basically.
Yeah.
Actually, more
But
like
there are 3D
FF3.
models for the
Actually, FF3, actually, I should say. With the whole class system and everything.
But it's much less common to change the... I mean, there's a whole, like, you're censoring their outfits and stuff, but I think that's sort of a minor thing compared to what would happen before.
I mean, I'm anti-censorship, period. I don't really care, because I don't believe in withholding information.
I think it should just be, like, an option, like...
Sure, options are fine.
If it's just a texture swap, you can just put in explicit yes or no.
Yeah, also in terms of localization, too, even... It's not really localization, but just in terms of censorship. You have Mortal Kombat, you put in the code for blood.
Yeah, instead of sweat.
Yeah, which just looks, honestly, gross.
Who sweats that?
So, not even...
Oh, I'm getting punched so hard. All this perspiration is coming out of my body.
Those Gatorade commercials in the 90s with colored sweat.
Is it in you?
Then there's interesting sort of mid-generation... In the PlayStation 1, there was the example of the first Persona game. It was Shin Megami Tensei Persona in Japan. But then they localized it as Revelations Persona, and it featured a number of strange changes to the character designs.
So they actually seriously did flip the titles around?
Yes.
Oh, I hate that. That reminds me of the weird Jackie Chan movies getting their titles flipped around.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Operation Condor and Armor of God. They released them opposite.
Oh.
And they flipped the titles. It's confusing as hell.
It's like the Balrog and Bison Vega situation.
Mm-hmm.
For those who don't know, there's the trio characters that were in Street Fighter 2 whose names were kind of swapped around from the West. The original M. Bison, that's the character we know as Balrog in the West, that's actually M. Bison. But they swapped the names around because they didn't want, like, people think it was a parody of Mike Tyson. But nowadays, because the tournament scene is so prevalent, they'll call everyone by their Japanese names because they're broadcasting to an international audience and they want everyone to follow along. So they call Vega Claw, they call M. Bison Dictator, etc. Because that is his Japanese name, Dictator.
I didn't know that and I love that.
So if you're ever watching EVO and you're watching Street Fighter 5 and they call the characters like different names, it's just so because they're streaming to an international audience and they want to make sure everyone will follow along.
I mean, I imagine the hardcore players know that.
Yes.
I mean, no casuals are watching EVO.
But like I was saying about Persona, they did a number of strange things to the characters to make them look more Western.
Mm-hmm.
There was a character in the original Japanese who wore a beanie, he wore a bunch of pins all over the beanie, very much looked like he was into hip-hop culture.
It was Mark.
They changed him just to a black kid.
Mark Dance Crazy. That was a line that they used.
It's one of the more infamous changes in Revelations Persona.
That's a bizarre change, too, in that sense, because usually you expect it to be like the opposite, although that would be probably more so localizing from the West to Japan, which, in another case of that, too, Crash Bandicoot.
Yes, because they made him, they changed the character, right?
They changed his face. They made the Japanese version of Crash, since Crash was developed in the US and came out in the US first. They made his face, I don't want to say like moe, but have a much more softer, cuter design, more expressive eyes.
Yes. They also...
He kind of has like Powerpuff Girl eyes, honestly.
They also changed the music. Mark Mulder's blog had to recompose a lot of the music for the Japanese version because they wanted it to sound more arcadey.
Yeah.
And he got only the vaguest notes from the Japanese developers, like, oh, the boss theme sounds too... we need to make it more exciting. Like, he has a lot of stories about how he had to change the music for all three games for the Japanese version. Ratchet and Clank on the PlayStation 2. The Japanese model for Ratchet has gigantic, exaggerated eyebrows.
Yeah.
That even when they made the mangas to promote the games in Japan, they would keep those eyebrows in the visual art to make it more expressive.
Jak and Daxter was altered a bit as well, specifically Daxter, because he is also like the furry creature.
What do they do with him?
It's pretty much the same thing with like Crash and stuff.
They just made him more expressive.
Yeah, a bit more anamorphic. And you actually, I believe there's a setting in Jak 3 you can actually change the model. In the collection, anyway.
Interesting.
Yeah, here's a really stupid localization that's kind of funny. I think it's only the Japanese version, for some reason, you have the ability to toggle Jack's goatee. Like his little beard on and off. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
It's one of the dumbest things ever. Like, only you get this because they didn't like it. So they gave him the option, which is one of the most odd options ever.
imagine being vociferous over a movie.
Sometimes there were also cases in which a game that is very specific to a certain culture only comes out in the wrong country, arguably. Monster Party for the NES is a famous example of this. It never came out in Japan despite being developed in Japan, and only the localized US version ever came out.
Yep. The ROM for the Japanese version is apparently out there, though.
Yes.
But the game that actually came out, the game was developed in Japan, but only came out in the US, and the game that came out was heavily, heavily altered, both with graphics and tone, as it was originally going to be a game that was... What was the actual original title? Do you know more?
Parody World Monster Party.
Yeah.
It was
It
all
featured a
about...
lot of horror movies.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it had like horror movies that are also more relevant to Eastern culture, though, especially with Japan in terms of like yokai and stuff and mythology. And when it came out as Monster Party, when it was actually released, you fought floating shrimp. I can't make this up.
What's the name for Japanese fried shrimp? But it was like tempura shrimp, basically.
It was tempura shrimp, but that's not what the model was supposed to be.
A
lot of models were changed.
Quite a bit of stuff.
There was this creepy giant spider thing that you're supposed to fight, but in the version that got released, it was already dead. In fact, you walk up to it and it says, "Sorry, I'm already dead." You imagine just, walking into a cemetery and you just see a skeleton lying there, and it doesn't. It starts talking, says, "Don't worry, I'm already dead." Oh, thanks. I feel much better.
The whole tone of that game is just kind of really offbeat and strange.
I don't even know how it got released,
It's
honestly,
just
because
very
I don't.
nice.
It is kind of expensive, isn't it? I've never seen it in the
Original
wild
cartridge?
once. I've never seen it in the wild once. Have you?
Monster Party might have been... Did Navy Jam play?
No, JonTron did.
Okay, that might be why a lot of the games spike in price.
It was underprinted though.
Oh, okay.
It definitely is not
It's
common.
about $20.
So $20,
15, 20 usually, yeah.
so it's not super expensive, but it's
It's
more than
sizable.
like your random Mario Duck Hunt cart.
Right.
The most valuable part.
Then sometimes you
Only
have...
a coffee table out of
Then sometimes you have cases of, okay, you have a translator who can do their job, but you only have like 3 months to do this.
Sounds like the modern game industry now.
I think Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger were key examples of that. I think they were both done by the translator Ted Woosley, who was very famous for inserting very creative lines that were not, or obviously in the Japanese version. Like, in Final Fantasy V, there was a moment in which the main character screams, "You spoony bard," during a fight.
That's where that came from.
Wait, what?
Oh.
You spoony bar?
Yes.
What kind of insult is that?
Then there's Kafka in Final Fantasy VI at one point says, "Son of a submariner."
I could see Kafka being like one of those characters that would be like super, super fun to like
Yes.
translate and like have a whole lot of wiggle room with and just kind of still have.
I mean, his
sense of it.
attitude is so
Yeah.
insane that since the game is still, 16-bit era, all text-based,
Yes.
you pretty much could just go nuts.
Yeah.
There's
Then-
no lips to match.
There was one famous case, Dragon Quest VII for the PS1. That came out a couple of years after the Japanese release because that game had reams and reams and reams of text.
I honestly did not even know we got 7 on the PS1.
Yeah, we did.
Huh.
But the translation is famously off kilter because they only had barely half a year to work on it. And there's a picture that the original translator took when he was beginning the project. Here's all the here's a whole shelf full of binders of Japanese text he has to translate. So they were very overworked. And he often said that the problem was, we only got the text once the game was completed, and then often these directors would be on other projects and we wouldn't have any way to talk to them about what the context of a certain line was. So if a character says, "Oh, that pot," or "Oh, that weapon," and then you didn't know what weapon they were talking about, because Japanese is very contextual, so they would just see the thing and they would just translate it kind of more or less directly, and they wouldn't have any context as to it. That was also the case with like some N64 games, because they would just get a raw output of all the text in the game, and they would have to translate it without knowing when in the game it would arrive. They would just have an Excel output of all the Japanese kanji, and they would have to go and in your dictionary to go translate the lines one by one. They sometimes wouldn't even be in the order they would be in the game.
Ew, how did you screw that up?
He explains that there weren't a lot of tools available at the time. They more or less were working on their own and without any help from the original developers and within a very limited span of time. So they really did their best. I think that's a case of, it's not like they had, let's go and screw it up, guys. Let's go and say, oh, they did a lazy job. Why are these translators so lazy?
Yeah, they don't. The people who are really lazy are the actual publishers. They're the ones paying these poor people pennies and giving them insane deadlines that are hard to meet.
Things are better nowadays, but it's also a case of localization for games is a very limited market. It's often said that if you're translating for for Crunchyroll or for some other company, for anime or for video games, it doesn't necessarily pay the best. You really have to be very passionate about it.
Yep.
And generally, you can make more money working as a translator for a bank or something.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So often, the group of people who are willing to go work these long hours to translate these games are often very. You work within tight schedules where you're working on multiple projects. This is jumping a bit to the present, but there are companies like NISA and Exceed they announce a couple of games and they might only get to 2 of them. They announced the game Uppers, which was a brawler for the Vita, to be localized and released on Steam and PS4 in 2018, and that game still isn't out in the West. Even if the localization is fine, sometimes that translation was used as the basis for other languages. For example, Final Fantasy VII was translated into English, and then they used the English translation as the basis for the Spanish one, but they very clearly used a lot of machine translation. So this isn't a direct line, this is paraphrasing. They would say, let's change the party member. Let's go meet the rest of the party. And they would use the word La Fiesta for the party instead of El Grupo, which would be more correct.
Yes, as proof here, automation is not coming after your job. It's clearly using it for certain things like this is bad. I feel like it in terms of doing it with that method, that's actually a good basis, and then a human being should actually play the game that speaks Spanish. And then they'd be like, well, this is a bit confusing, I'll fix that. That is laziness, I won't say it's not.
Or one that happened more recently for the game Grandia 2, which was then retranslated and re-released on Steam and other platforms. They translated the word miss as in Miss Attack, which is just Fraulein, which means a married woman.
And it's rude to call a woman that in Germany.
And speaking of Germany, too, in terms of a lot of localization that intentionally does censor information, usually with something in terms of historical context or political discourse. Anything related to Nazi-like stuff, like I said, World War II, Hitler, often definitely gets censored immediately.
They often have a version of the violence. Team Fortress 2 was infamously localized. A lot of times, shooters would go and get localized and they change the characters to robots.
Yeah, and Wolfenstein.
Yes.
That was probably the worst or best fan definition example.
Or you would have Battlefield 5, which came out recently. They just didn't include swastikas in a game about World War II.
It would be hilarious if they changed them to something absolutely ridiculous, like happy faces.
I mean, that's kind of the
problem. How terrifying would that be?
Sometimes if they don't want to go back and change it later on, they might just make the visual identity in such a way that it doesn't refer directly to it, although it's still the same vibe. The first Captain America movie came out, they used Red Skull instead of Hitler to get the same feel of fighting the Nazis without using Nazi imagery, even if Captain America was used as a propaganda symbol for American pride against the Nazis.
Which I generally speaking should have been but that's just my opinion. We're going to discuss it. Not saying what you should or shouldn't do.
So I guess...
But that's definitely taking it to a more extreme end of localization where we are definitely changing this and we do not care about the source material because of this particular message.
For the most part, I think localizations nowadays are typically pretty faithful, but they can vary in quality due to the size of the team working on the project. Not everyone is Treehouse, which for those who don't know is Nintendo's internal translation group.
If you want to talk localization being intentionally bad, dumbed down, or weak, Treehouse and the newer Fire Emblem games are a good example of that. And yep, Melora, go.
Treehouse is weak. Alright, go on.
Don't start with 3 houses.
Alright.
Fire Emblem 3 houses.
Well, don't start with 3 houses.
No, I don't love 3 houses. I don't really know a whole lot about the translation for 3 houses. I haven't really been following the fandom in general as closely. I used to be way more wrapped up with Fire Emblem happenings.
Well, Treehouse, they didn't start getting involved till Awakening, right?
So Awakening, you had a lot of changes in the backstories of the character. Henry, you get a little bit more insight into his backstory. His parents really didn't like him. They sent him off to kind of a boarding school where they just kind of abused him and made fun of him, and that's why he's always smiling, because he was always sad.
So how was that changed, then, with localization?
I think they allude to it slightly, but they don't totally go into detail about it. It's definitely much darker in the original Japanese. Something similar happened in Three Houses recently, where Bernadetta's character, Bernadetta was abused by her mom. And they would change a line, yes, about her being tied to a chair to be a good submissive wife or something, and they just made it way more vague.
That's interesting, though, also, because there's a lot of the game compilations coming out are usually using the more localized versions that have, like, the censorship or the adaptions. We talked about this in the Castlevania episode, but Castlevania Requiem, which comes with a lot of what people consider to be the best, the version of Symphony of Night is not the PS1 voice acting.
Yeah, they actually bothered redoing all of them. That happened to Silent Hill 2, too.
Everybody likes it, and they didn't give you the option. They said, nope, you get this one. That's it.
Because what would often happen is, in the 2000s, there weren't like big localization departments in the West, or it wasn't easy access to dubbing companies. So sometimes the Japanese studios would just do all the English voice acting out of just people who were in Tokyo. Shenmue was a famous example of that. Like, it was all just people who were living in Tokyo at the time, just voice acting for this game. With not the best voice directors, because they weren't native English speakers.
The one thing I want to say in terms of absolute lazy localization, not only just for the purposes of censorship, but also just not even trying, of the one other Fire Emblem thing I wanted more to mention, was regarding actually Fire Emblem Fates.
Oh, it's bad.
Yeah.
Yay, my favorite bad game.
To be fair, all the localization and censorship of Fire Emblem can much be summed up as in, this is really dark and we just want to basically make the tone not as disturbing or difficult for audiences to digest. Then there's just not trying at all. Melora?
In one of the supports between Saizo and Baruka, who they call Belka in the Japanese, and I prefer that romanization much better because it just sounds less awkward. There's a part where Saizo is introducing himself, and I think they're both just like introducing themselves to each other. Belka says that she knows of Saizo and his pedigree and everything. But
and they're both assassins, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah, so they both deal with and kill.
They're both very cold sorts of people. Belka even more so.
They had a whole exchange in the Japanese version, and then the Western version.
The Western version,
they being silent toward each other.
It was
it was just like a stare down, and that's the whole support. And it's over long before the Japanese one's actually over.
The text box is just literally dots.
It's just an ellipse. That's all they look at each other, and it's just.
They didn't even try to. They didn't even try to come up with something.
No, and they also made one of the characters. I think was it Takami's kid or was it somebody else? I don't know. It was Hinata. Changed his dialogue to make him really like pickles.
You know, sometimes amusing, and in this case, it just sounds really stupid.
The Neptunia games are pretty infamous for this. In Japanese, they're fairly dry dialogue. They would just say, "Oh, what's this?" But then they would change that in English to, "Holy shnikes, guys, what is up with this?"
That sounds more moe and cutesy to me.
Yes, so they would do that just because that's the general tone of the games. Or Danganronpa has some moments where they insert memes, or there's a moment in Danganronpa 1 where the main antagonist makes a chef by Ardijo. And then there's some, I remember reading on 4chan, they would make fun of the Trails of Cold Steel games for just seemingly making up dialogue from the original Japanese. So the character would say, like, "Oh, Naruhodo," and then they would move on, and the English version would say, "I guess that's the case, huh, guys?"
Yeah, not really the same impact.
But it's a lot of cases of sometimes people criticize translators for effectively writing their interpretation of it instead of the literal dialogue that is being said.
Yeah, and there's definitely an art to that because, like we stated before, the dialect and the way it's presented is not the same between English and Japanese.
Yes.
Especially because, like, you can't tell an English joke in Japanese. It's not possible. Like, a horse walks into a bar, where you literally have the actual subject and then the action. That won't work in Japanese, period.
And then Japanese has the levels of politeness that you could say things with.
Yeah.
Typically, a lot of anime characters, from what I've read, will speak in like a casual sort of tone, which is not how you should speak to everyone in Japan. You can speak super formally, like if you're working as a service job. You can speak as if you're speaking to like your family. You're speaking in an elder or someone in power. You can speak like between friends. So there's different levels of that that are not easily translatable.
Yeah, you think if it's not what you say, it's how you say it in English is confusing.
Or you might even have different dialects might be different. For example, there's the region of Osaka.
Yes.
And the Osaka accent is a very particular kind of country-esque accent, which is why often when it's translated, it's just like a southern accent or like a Higgish accent in English.
Yeah, sometimes you get like that. Sometimes you get like that Bronx accent too. Just any kind of like really harsh accent, like Cockney.
I mean, for some reason, 4Kids just wanted so many Yu-Gi-Oh characters to be from Australia. and that's it.
It might have just been one. They only have so many actors. Maybe that's just what the person could do.
Probably. Also, in terms of really lazy localization where they didn't even try, I know you want to mention the Shining Force remake on Game Boy Advance.
There's a character, I forgot his name, I heard this from a friend, but there's a character who in the original, even in the original English version, had like a fairly roguish sort of snide personality, and then they remade the game for the Game Boy Advance and they localized that. And then the character is a Pokemon, effectively, who just says his name over as his dialogue. I guess because maybe they view the Game Boy Advance as mainly for kids, so they didn't want to like have this kind of atonal character in there.
You're remaking a game that wasn't intended for that audience, or at least that young of an audience. That
There were mature games for the Game Boy Advance, but there weren't a lot of them.
Was it Doom on Game Boy Advance?
Yeah, there was some X vs. Sever, there was Return to Castle Wolfenstein.
There were some Castlevania games. I wouldn't give Castlevania to a 6-year-old.
I mean, Circle and
Well, I give it to my 6-year-old. If I have one, but that's a different story.
I think all of them on the DS and the Game Boy Advance were T.
Yeah, they were T. But they had elements of blood, and there's uncensored titties in there, actually, if you look close enough.
Thank you, Succubi. There's very light pixel titties.
Yes, it's like to the point of like you can't really say anything. Unlike looking at even a TV screen, it's a tiny GBA. You can get away with a lot more on portable systems, I noticed, in terms of translations, too.
Yes.
Because the tiny screen.
Sometimes it was a case of you can't fit this number of characters within a text box, so you have to abbreviate anything. Dialogue.
I remember playing Lufia The Legend Returns on Game Boy Color when I was much younger. I think it was rated kids to adults or E or some...
KA.
Yes.
E wasn't a thing yet. It was KA.
E and E10 were a thing by the early 2000s.
Yes. KA carried over to 2000.
Right.
That was the last year it was.
So it had a very benign rating, and then all of a sudden, I think sometime after the first boss battle, or sometime around that time, one of the characters stabbed the other character, the little sprite fell to the ground, and there was just blood all around him, and then they said, shit! And I'm like, wow, my 6-year-old mind cannot comprehend this right now. What the
A lot of things
They snuck so many things in that game.
A lot of things could slip through the ratings boards because the way in which games are rated for different countries
It's from the video,
changed.
don't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
What the publishers are required to do, especially after the hot coffee incident from Rockstar in the mid-2000s.
Oh, yeah.
So what would happen before hot coffee, that's a whole other story, is they would effectively submit a VHS or a DVD of the spiciest things or the most things of note.
Mm-hmm.
And then the ESRB would put that sort of, violence, comic action, things like that in the description, use blood, drug use, implied whatever. But then Hot Coffee happened, which is a completely hidden kind of secret minigame, and now the ESRB, they have to be completely honest to the ESRB. They can't sneak anything past them.
Yeah.
In terms of also localization, too, with different countries, we talked about before in terms of usually the West definitely tones down like sexual imagery and stuff a lot more, especially from games that come from Japan. On the opposite end, though, Japan actually tones down violence, which America loves violence. Oh, someone's head gets exploded? That gets an M. Maybe even a teen.
The No More Hero games are pretty famous for that. No More Heroes 1, when it was released in Japan, if you played the game, when you do the finisher moves, a spurt of blood comes from the enemies, but they changed that to black, blood to black.
Yep. And the new Resident Evil 2, well, not bad news, but last year's Resident Evil 2 remake actually has two versions in Japan. Zero D and Zero Z. Z being basically the American version fully intact, which is ironic because it's a Japanese developed game, by the way.
Yes.
Whereas Zero D is more censored, so the gore is not as prominent, corpses don't fall open with like organs that fall over, and I think there's also less hints to any actual drug use or anything, like smoking and stuff. Which is, again, kind of ironic, because Japan actually has that in spades. Yeah. That was removed from, in terms of, games with localization. I think Snatcher had that stuff removed, actually.
Yeah. I do know that the Sero ratings board is very particular with... Actually, in terms of sexual content, they will ask Japanese developers, is there an upskirt at all?
Yeah.
They will ask, is there a model viewer in the game, and if so, can you see the girl's underwear? You're required by Sero to go and say, if you play the Hatsune Miku games and you look at Miku in the model viewer, if you try to look under her skirt, the game will say this is not viewable. This ain't.
I mean, I don't even know why you even include that. And the look at. I mean, I would just. It's a bit odd with the model thing, but that actually is a perfect segue too into censorship for those purposes, especially the differences with Sony and Nintendo right now.
Yeah, in the past, Nintendo was thought as the kiddie company who would go and make all these changes to make the games family friendly. But nowadays, with Sony's, they moved their headquarters over to California, and even Japanese games, when they have to be, every game released on a Sony platform has to be vetted in California by like an English board within Sony. So often, there's a famous case of the game Omega Labyrinth for the PS4 and Vita. When they were releasing the PlayStation 4 version in Japan, they had two separate versions for Sony and Nintendo. For Nintendo, they would get Omega Labyrinth, which was it's an enhanced version of a Vita game, and the Switch version is just completely intact. And Omega Labyrinth is a very, let's just say, horny dungeon crawling game.
Right.
They even made fun of the fact they had to censor it for the Sony platform. The game is called Labyrinth Life. The logo had like an Omega symbol next to a character's breasts in the logo in the Switch version, but they removed that character and it's called Labyrinth Life for the PS4 version. They removed much of the sexual elements, and they literally advertised it in the Japanese trailer, like acknowledging how silly this is. This is for if you have a family, or if you have family around and you just want to play this game.
I actually kind of want to play it as if it's actually that cheeky about it. As long as it's like being honest about itself and what it is.
Literally in the trailer it says, play the Switch version if you live alone, play Labyrinth Life if you live with your family.
That's really stupid though, because the fact that if the whole point of the game is supposed to be like super cheeky and like, you know,
the game's plot
on the nose about this stuff, why even make a censored version?
The game's plot is literally about a bunch of teenage girls who go adventuring in a dungeon to get bigger boobs. And part of the combat mechanics involves, oh whoops, the button is snapping off of my top.
Poetry.
That damages the enemies. This is kind of embarrassing to talk about, but there's also a mechanic in which, how do you power up your weapons? Well, you
can't even say it. I don't even know what it is, and I'm laughing.
I'll say this, but I won't put it in the recording. You rub the weapon between the breasts of the girl. On the Vita version, you would rub it up and down the touchscreen.
Oh, yes. That was the thing removed from Fire Emblem 2 with localization.
Oh
yes.
my god, the petting.
And that's actually relevant, especially you get like the whole Pokemon.
I am so glad the child units are gone, and I am so glad that just marriageable crap during the course of the game is gone. 3 houses, it just kind of happens at the end, and it's so much better that way, because you could actually focus on, the game.
But
what
it's
they would
also
do with Fire Emblem Fates for the uninitiated is you would have a closeness mechanic that was in the Japanese version, which means that the 3DS touchscreen that rub the face of the character in order to get their affinity up.
Well, now you have tea parties, which are just not very, not as offensive. You can still look at.
I don't know
certain ways.
I don't know how bad I want to have a tea party with like certain characters.
You want to have a tea party
with anybody, honestly.
If you have a tea party with Manuela, she literally says, "You're seductive gays."
I want to have a tea party with Mrs. Nesbitt.
Oh, no.
If somebody can hack the game and put that in, I'll do that. I am Mrs. Nesbitt!
Then even upcoming games are sort of being affected by the quote-unquote Sony censorship policy, which I think people are overreacting to in a lot of ways. But it's obvious that the standards have changed, like companies have to release projects globally.
I would be happier if Sony, maybe Japan's approach of 2 versions. I think that'd be better.
You had cases of, for example, the game Dead or Alive Extreme Venus Edition. Dead or Alive wasn't officially released in the Western territories with a Western version. There is an Asia region one with English subtitles you can buy, but they more or less avoided releasing it in the West because they thought they would sell well here, they thought it would be too controversial here.
Yeah, that's not a terrible move. Obviously, the diehard fan is just going to import it anyway, or download it digitally off Japanese PSN.
And the company PlayAsia famously said, hey guys, well this game isn't getting released at GameStop, why don't you buy it from us? And they actually made a ton of money off of that.
That doesn't surprise me.
Some people called PlayAsia's approach a little crass, but I thought they were just having fun with it. They weren't, doing anything.
PlayAsia, they existed pretty much to get you imported goods. I bought Japanese DDR Extreme off PlayAsia. It was not all over eBay back then. You had to. Now you can find it anywhere. Although it's still pretty pricey.
For those who don't know what happened to Lixing, Lixing was a company in the mid-2000s that was popular for importing, but then they decided to sell the PSP to people early, and then Sony basically sued them out of existence.
I think they also tried to sell mod chips.
Yes, they tried to do that, A. Then B, they wanted to jump over the tax laws in order to go and sell this unit to people outside of Japan.
And I won't lie, both PlayAsia and Lixing too, but there is a markup.
Yes.
You want the game for its actual price, or even probably cheaper, because it has SynDuo. even European currency is going to convert even better because that's worth more. Go to Japan yourself and buy it. That's why a lot of people, when a lot of weebs, when they go to Japan, they buy a shit ton of games that are way cheaper.
But nowadays,
I bought a couple when I was there that were definitely...
Bought me Ava games.
you can have cases of when games get re-released. Speaking of Fire Emblem, or speaking of Persona, we have Sharp FE.
Yeah.
One is Tokyo Mirage Sessions Encore.
I mean,
Which was based on a version of the Western version of the game. They changed a lot of the female characters' outfits to be a little less skimpy, and they used that version as the basis for the remastered.
That's where the vagina bones meme came from. Because you just had that one weekly complaining.
Yes.
vagina
Not only
bones?
there was a really weird tweet about a guy looking at the differences between the outfits. Not only did they release the cleavage, but they removed her vagina bones.
That's not a thing.
But the Japanese audience actually got really upset about the fact that it was quote-unquote censored.
And then
Nintendo was like,
the pre-orders.
Nintendo was like, normally we don't allow digital pre-orders to be canceled, but in this case, if you really wanted to, or even games from as far back as like 1999, they would go and change the character designs. Like in Final Fantasy VIII Remastered, there was the character.
Everything surrounding that game is just so much of a tire fire that I just kind of refuse to touch it.
Well, regardless
That's
of
probably
your
my loss.
Well, let me finish what I'm saying. In
Yeah.
VIII Remastered, the summon Shiva, she has blue skin and she's dressed very provocatively.
Yeah.
She shoots ice at you, effectively.
Yeah.
But her outfit was changed for the remastered version from very skinny to keep looking more decent.
They changed the siren too. I was gonna state that too. It seems even remasters aren't immune to this either with the constant changes. And I swear, video games are going through like a lot of a similar sense these days to like film re-releases, like the infamous Star Wars special editions.
Yeah.
Where they literally keep changing things. Are we gonna have a time 20 to 30 years from now when people remember the original episode 7 of Star Wars before it was digitally altered or something?
Yeah. And then there's some interesting cases of when games get... There's a concept of, for those that don't know, dub titles. So even if you can play a game with Japanese audio, sometimes the English subtitles will be based on the localized or the dubbed audio. Right. Famously, some of the early Ghibli movies when they were localized by Disney, if you watch it with Japanese audio, there would still be some of the English jokes in the subtitles, even though the characters are saying nothing at all in the Japanese audio. If you watch The Cat Returns with Japanese audio and English subtitles, there's a moment where like some characters are flying away on an umbrella floating into the air, and there's like 3 or 4 different extra jokes. This is a thing common in film in general. The comedian Pat Oswalt once made a joke about how sometimes movies are afraid to have silence, or they think that the scene, not enough is happening in the scene, so in post-production they'll add a couple extra jokes in the background so people don't get bored.
Yeah. I don't think that's too bad, at least, because if you're watching it in its original language with the dub titles, then you probably don't know the original language.
Yeah.
If you know both, then I'm sorry, your head's probably going to be chaos trying to watch that.
Melora, have you ever watched something with Japanese audio and English subtitles and you know enough Japanese to know if they're saying something different?
Oh, definitely.
There's a lot of cases of that.
Yes.
I don't know a lot of Japanese myself, but sometimes I will notice that in the dialogue, they'll say one thing and then the subtitles make something else. For example, this is a non-game related example, but JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is famous for this because nearly every single character is named after a musician reference. Right? So there's a character named Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap that in the English version is called D4C. And then in the game, in the fighting game, which is localized in English, no one knows what D4C means. It's very mysterious. Even though in the Japanese audio, he'll say, "Dirty deeds done for dirt cheap."
Oh my god.
Terrible. What was that, the PS1 game?
The PS2 game. So, no. It was the PS4 fighting game.
Oh, this is new.
Yes.
That's pathetic. You have the internet these days. There's no excuse.
Or I think there's a character named like Vanilla Ice, and they just call him Iced in English.
Well,
They're legally required to change the name to something different, even if
why not just be period ice? People would get the joke and you wouldn't have to worry about copyright.
It's been a thing forever, and since JoJo's got more popular in the anime world, more popular in the localized games, they would do that.
I mean, again, the thing with anime games and stuff, though, they're pretty much selling to the demographic that already knows everything. It's a bigger issue when you're selling an RPG or a game that's new, and it's a new IP or it's a totally separate story. Like, all the Final Fantasies are different stories. They're not connected, except for the actual sequel. So, if that gets translated poorly or something. There's nothing to go on. There's no source material. This is what you get.
Yes. And sometimes you would get cases, and this is another example within games, there were cases in which you get the sequel before the original game.
That's the Jackie Chan problem.
So there was a game released in the Vita, early PS4 era called Conception 2. We never got the original Conception, and it will only come out much later as Conception Plus. Or for example, we got the game Akiba's Trip, Undead and Undressed, which is Akiba's Trip 2 in Japan. We never got the original one for the PSP until we got the Akiba's Trip remaster for the PS4. I was playing that with Shadow a couple years ago. We were playing Akiba's Trip Undead and Undressed. And there's a moment in which the protagonist of the original game showed up, and I knew who he was because I knew the game was a sequel, that Shadow was really confused with who the guy was.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I think moving on to the future, though, it's hard to say how many problems we're still going to have. I think thinking in terms of just actual old school games, we now have banned translations, ROM hacks, all kinds of things like that.
Yes.
Are basically giving you the best of both worlds. You've got accurate translation, or more accurate at least from dedicated fans that want the original story the way it's presented, but in a way that makes sense. You've got all of the sexual, religious, controversial imagery restored as it was.
Yes.
I think that's really good, especially for games. The reason we can do this too is because those games, admittedly, they have less technical requirements.
Yes.
They were amazing in their time, but now you can emulate them on a Windows XP machine.
Yeah.
Newer games, though, it's kind of a toss-up still.
It really depends on the company. For example, the company Sega is really good about doing faithful translations for like the Yakuza series and the spin-off Judgment. When they did the remaster collection for 3, 4, and 5, they actually went back and retranslated the whole script. And there were comparisons between the original PS3 versions and then the PS4 version that came out recently. And then there's cases like the game Judgment, in which not only is there a dub, they made a point in the trailers by saying you can play this game with Japanese audio, and the subtitles are not just from the dub, they're properly translated from the Japanese audio. Which is a far cry from Atlas and what they would do in the Persona games, even the modern Persona games, far from the Revelations Persona case. Persona 5 is a scene in which one of the characters, they're in like the red light district, and then these two men come up to one of the characters within the party and kind of hit on him, and they're very obviously gay. And then there were some people who went and like complained about it, and then Atlas West basically went and said, we're going to go and change those lines for the release of the re-release version called Persona 5 Royale.
Yeah, localization, a lot of it now seems to do more so with like an original version coming out and then outcry from people, and not even as a gamer sometimes. But regardless, the companies are responding to it. Catherine, in terms of Atlas, is another example of that.
There's a character in Catherine who's a trans woman named Erica. And in the original version of Catherine, released on the PlayStation 3 and the 360, the character is referred to by their dead name, Eric, in the credits. But when they released it over in the West, they changed the character to her current name, Erica, in the credits.
Now, I will state, compared to the stuff we all just talked about, this is a far cry from that big of a deal.
I mean, some people say, should we go as localizers and work with the original people to ensure that we have respectful treatment towards minority characters within the scripts and stuff?
I'm going to honestly say I don't care either way. I'm going to care about things that actually do affect story tone and gameplay, though.
Yes.
So if the impact is changed, I care. If it's a credit scene, whatever.
I mean, in terms of like changing the scene outright, in my opinion, as it relates to gay characters, I'm gay myself, and I can say that the Japanese have a very different perception of homosexuality than the West does.
Yes.
And to impose what I think versus what they think would be kind of, I think, unnecessary. That might not be how some other people feel, but that's just how I personally feel.
And I'm looking in your notes, you see OCR translation feature and emulators? What's that?
So there's a feature that is in beta within RetroArch that allows you, it's a plugin, you can press a button and then it will scan the screen for like Japanese text. It will scan the text and then send it off to a translation service, usually Google Translate, and then it will overlay the translation on top of the text.
Ah, yes. So that means now I can play Final Fantasy VII and join the Fiesta in real time.
Yes. So AI translation is also a really interesting avenue, because in theory, what some people have done, I've read some threads on 4chan about people playing through like eroge that are never going to be translated into English ever, just propping up their phone and then reading it through the Google Lens translation. And people are like, oh, I can play through the whole game like this. I might not get the whole thing, but it's good enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's.
I've done that too, admittedly.
I mean, yeah, I can understand it. Whatever works. I mean, you're already playing niche games to begin with.
Yes.
So the very fact you even have this option is a godsend compared to 20 years ago.
Companies know that people have a higher standard for translation now than in the past, so therefore I think ideally they're going to be more mindful of what the Western audience would like. Some people would want more of a direct translation. For certain other products, they might have it more localized.
And some people are Konami.
What happened with Konami in translation?
Konami doesn't really try at all. Well, especially also, like I said, this has the Castlevania games, Metal Gear.
Well, I think actually in the 2000s, the Metal Gear games got pretty famous because Kojima already had a very heady sort of writing style, very philosophical and referring to things from all different cultures, Japanese and Western. And then the localizer, I think you could follow her on Twitter. I think she's responsible for that famous speech that is given at the end of Metal Gear Solid 2, for example.
I should put this in a better perspective. I meant in terms of a company that doesn't listen to their fans at all.
Yes.
Silent Hill Slot Machine. Like
it has nothing to do with translation, arguably, so I don't know what
It has to do with the fact that if you want a translation for Konami, the chances are in hell. That's what I meant. Well, closing thoughts?
I think, like I said, I think companies recognize that fans have higher standards, and some fans even take it upon themselves to learn Japanese and then translate games for other people. So I think it's a much healthier market for translation now than ever, and hopefully more games from the past get translated, more games in the future that might have otherwise been unpalatable for the Western audience get translated, and I hope we'll be able to just play more games. Not all gamers speak the same language, therefore those who speak different languages can either help in the translation or not just kind of beg a company to go and translate something.
Sure. And Melora?
I hope that the hard work of translators and what they do is recognized and seen increasingly as an art form, and that the nuances and the difficulties of translation and localization are appreciated and brought into greater awareness to a larger variety.
Yeah, that seems fair. And you already said your final thoughts, right, Liz?
No. How I feel about in terms of localization, I think there's pros and cons to it, and there's certain things that I agree with and don't. I think it's definitely important in terms of understanding languages are not going to always mean the same thing when translating. So taking some creative liberty there to try to present something that would make sense for that particular locale is good. I think that's being done better these days. I don't think there's any good in censoring something and directly taking away its impact, its meaning, or trying to tone it down. And if you do need to do that because you are afraid of sales, I think the best approach is just options. Just like I stated with DLC and stuff. Have options. I would like the game in its original form, its original intent. If you want to sell it to an audience that prefers something that isn't as direct meaning to it, then make a different option. Or just, better yet, storage is fantastic these days. Just put both on the disc or in the digital download, really. It's a menu change away.
Or if disk space is a concern, like it was with certain Vita games, put the English language on the cartridge and then have the other available on the store.
It's not a concern anymore, dude. Even Switch cartridges can hold, I believe, 25 gigs.
Yes, but the different sizes of the Switch cartridges are a manufacturing concern, too.
True, but that's for digital down. Or even better yet, digital patch is fine, at least. I mean, it still sucks in the sense of it's not going to be on the physical form, but at least it's there.
Yes. Oh yeah, we forgot to mention, there's another thing, phenomena of undubbing that is available. People will go and take a game only available in English, and then put in the original Japanese audio. Like, you can do this with Persona 4, for example, which is a re-release of Persona 4.
Yeah, I think a lot of fan projects are honestly going to help a lot with bridging the gap in terms of what is practically being lost to history.
Yes.
But I also really would like companies to pay attention to this.
Yes.
And go for it.
Or even games such obscure as 428 only came about because of a poll on Twitter. So you have to be vocal about what you want.
Yes. I love this game, by the way.
Oh my god,
you need to finish this game.
It's so good.
Just put an image at the end of just Kaza just like...
It's the best book
Minori
ever.
Kawa, the reporter, just pointing his finger. You have to send me that.
He's got the Phoenix right finger that just goes...
Alright, so I think we said all we can say about translation, so...
And localization.
Arigatou gozaimashita.
Sure.
Thank you all very much.
And also, thank you for watching, listening to Pixel Vision Podcast, whatever. Tell us what you honestly think about localization and game translation. Is it good? Is it bad? What do you feel is correct? What do you feel is taking away from the industry? And ultimately, what do you think we can do to actually improve it? Because I know there's a lot of people still who their fighting games aren't translated correctly, and there's still a whole lot of good that can be done. Anyway, I'm Gamer Rez.
I'm DeftBeck.
And I'm Melora.
Laters.
See you later.